Moderator in charge of vertebrate paleontology and your moderator of this evening's entertainment, Smackdown at the Peabody. Yeah. And in this corner, wearing the blue shirt, better than 200 pounds, more than 6 foot. It's my honor and pleasure to introduce the reigning world champion, Jack the Hammer. And in this corner, wearing the red power tie, but under 6 foot and under 200 pounds, is Nick the Knife Longrich. Defender of Yale's honor. And the subject for our debate tonight, of course, is the species status of a Torosaurus versus Triceratops. Jack will begin by presenting his case, basically that Torosaurus is a full-grown Triceratops, and thus the same species. Following that, Nick will present his thesis, which is that Torosaurus and Triceratops represent very different species of horned dinosaurs. And with that, gentlemen, start your motors. And, wait a second, like, no biting, no gouging, and no low blows. But given that we're working on ceratopsians, of course, we have to allow headbutting. And with that, let's begin. Pardon me? Yes, we'll get the lights down. I think Jack will present first, then Nick, and they'll get a chance to rebut one another's arguments, and then we'll open the questions to the floor at large.
All right, well, needless to say, it feels like Jack versus all of New Haven. Yes, wow. Okay, so this is our question up here. Triceratops or Triceratops and Torosaurus. And it is an interesting question. This is a subject that my student John Scannella and I have been working on for a while. And basically what I'd like to remind everyone, this is a quote from John Ostrom of Yale University. Even though everyone knows that there will be anatomical differences between any two individuals, a long-standing paleontological tradition emphasizes these differences in establishing new taxa while underrating morphological similarities. Like, do you keep that in mind? That was said here. Now, one of the things that we like to do at Montana State University, is we think that you cannot really truly evaluate a taxon of any kind, determine what it's related to, until you have a lot of scientific information. You need data, and that includes geographic data, taphomorphologic data, stratigraphy. You need to know where it is in time. You need to know what kind of sediments that it's in. And you also need to know whether it's a juvenile or not. You need to know its ontogeny. In other words, you need to sort of know its growth stages. And so that's what we do. Every time we don't, someone once said that it looked like we had a hit list of animals we were trying to get rid of. That is not true. What we are trying to do is evaluate all of them using the same kind of data. So, with that in mind, think about the Triceratops specimens that are here at Yale. And there's lots of them. Marsh and Hatcher and a lot of people went out and collected a lot of Triceratops specimens. And they collected them from Wyoming, where they have a pretty good idea, at least according to John Ostrom, of where they came from. geographically, but not stratigraphically. You do not have the stratigraphic information. They have no taphomorphologic information, and as far as I know, no ontogenetic information. So basically, of all the data they need, they have very little. And in 1999, I started what we call the Hell Creek Project in Montana, and the idea was to spend 10 years, at least, collecting as much data as we could possibly get, including as many new specimens as we could get, so we had all this kind of information. And we went out and we collected everything, and we spent incredible amounts of money. I suggest I think Yale should go out and do this again, actually. And we collected everything, no matter how bad it looked. If it looked like this, we went out and collected it. And we used helicopters and we used boats. We virtually could go anywhere and collect anything. So there was nothing left that we didn't collect. And we also sent out geologists that determined stratigraphically where every single specimen was. So we have the stratigraphic information. And just to give you a small sampling, we collected over 100 new Triceratops specimens. 100. And we have prepared quite a few of them already, although we only have 4 preparators and it takes a while. But we have them all in stratigraphic sequence. And they're beautiful things. And amongst them, we found lots of juveniles, things that people had not seen before. So we have an awful lot of stuff. And we have ontogenetic series. We have babies all the way through what we consider full-grown adults. But here's our storage area, still filled with specimens we have not yet prepared. We collected for a long time. We collected a lot of stuff, and we prepare a lot of stuff, but we still have a lot of specimens unprepared, but we've seen them in the field. All right. So one of the things that we've learned is that by looking at them stratigraphically, we see that actually there are different species from different levels. There was, for a long time, there was thought, when Ostrom went out and looked, he came to the conclusion, he and Wellenhofer came to the conclusion that there was probably one species. And then some years ago, Kathy Forrester went through and looked at all the Triceratops specimens again and came to the conclusion that there was a Prorsus and a Horridus. And she thought maybe it was a geographic thing. But we have since found all of the Horridus specimens are at the bottom of the formation, all of the Prorsus specimens are at the top of the formation, and we even have some intermediate things in between. We don't, it's hard to say what they are. But they do sort out by species. And if you look at the Triceratops specimens there, you'll see that Prorsus has a big nose horn, whereas Horridus has a smaller nose horn. We also have found that there is a difference in fusion of bones. In other words, whether bones are all hooked together or not by looking through time, stratigraphically. If you look at the bottom picture here, you see a nose horn of Horridus, and it fuses onto the nasal bone early during its growth. But in Prorsus, the big nosed horn fuses on very late in ontogeny, and it comes from higher in section. So if we're going to talk about bone fusion and how things hook together, we have to know where we are stratigraphically. And this goes for all of our specimens, but on top of that is taphomorphology, where it's actually found. Because we have found that all of the specimens we find in sandstone are actually articulated, and that means all the skulls are together, as though they are fused together. And all the specimens that we find in mudstone are disarticulated, which means they've all come apart. So here are 2 specimens. They're both the same size. One of them is articulated altogether. The other one, the bottom one, was actually disarticulated, and I've just sort of pieced it back together there. So taphomorphology makes a great deal of difference. It is thought that oftentimes when bones aren't fused together, that suggests that an animal is a juvenile. but what it more likely suggests is how long it's been sitting out on the ground. Now, when we get our specimens, when we actually go out and collect our specimens, whether they're articulated or whether they're not articulated, we do something that most museums, in fact, virtually all museums in the world, don't do. We go out and get our bones, we bring them back to our museum, we carefully prepare them, and then we cut them. And we cut them in many places. So these arrows show places we have cut this one particular Triceratops, and every Triceratops specimen we have cut into the bone to see how old it is, to determine its ontogeny. And so we have ontogenetic data. And if you look on the left here, you see a juvenile. This is a juvenile Triceratops. You can tell juveniles because their horns curve backward. And juvenile bone is very easy to identify. On the right is a Torosaurus. That's the Toromorph, we call it. And you can see it has what we call dense Haversian bone. And so it's really easy to tell a juvenile from an adult. Now, obviously, the growth stages in between go anywhere from the juvenile bone to the adult bone. And so the more adult bone you have in it, the older the animal is. So it's pretty simple to figure that out. So if we compare, now, for the most part, if you go up and look at in the museum collection or up on display here, and you look at the Triceratops specimens, most of them are in the range of about 6 feet long, 2 meters long. Torosaurus is in the 3-meter range. So if we just make a comparison between Triceratops, the frill of Triceratops, and the Toromorph, cut into them and look at them, it's real simple to see that the Triceratops morph is still growing. It has juvenile or subadult bone, whereas the Toromorphs have mature bone, dense Haversian bone. Now, another thing we do is actually measure the thickness of the shield. Now remember, the shield of a Torosaurus has holes in it. The shield of a Triceratops does not. So what's the difference? Well, in a juvenile Triceratops, the bone is the same thickness from the edge of it all the way. The whole shield has about the same thickness to it. But as the animal gets older and older, part of the shield begins to thin. And here we see a 6-foot-long articulated Triceratops on the left and a 6-foot-long disarticulated Triceratops on the right. And the one on the left you can see has a 3-centimeter thick rim around the outside and a 5/10 of a centimeter thick interior. So it's very different. And if we look at the shield that we have down here in the bottom, this parietal shield even has places where it's broken out where the holes would be. And the reason it's all broken in the areas where the holes would be is because it's really thin. The bone is very thin there. But we've cut all the way through the shield just to check it. Just cut the whole thing in two. And we've cut the whole several of them all in two. And here you can see, this is a thin section through this shield, and you can see that the exterior, which is on the left here, is relatively thick, but as you go to the right, which takes it into the center of the shield, it gets thinner and thinner. And we can look at that bone, and we can actually see that the growing section, which is on the right, this is bone that is still getting bigger. The shield is still getting longer, but on the interior, it is actually eroding. It is what we call resorbing. And you can tell it's resorbing because where you see the yellow line up there on the top, it's actually cutting into some of that dense Haversian bone. And it's cutting in both on the dorsal and the ventral side, which means that it's going to get thinner than it is. When the animal died, it was thinning. And if we look right at the place where that bone is broken, right where it's 0.5 centimeter in thick, thickness, you can see more dense Haversian bone that is being thinned by resorption. So it is going to get thinner. And basically what we're saying is that it is going to thin so far that it will make a hole. So if we look at the thinned part of a toromorph, in other words, cut right into the bone of the shield of one that does have holes in it, we see exactly the same thing. The edges around the hole are thinning, and those holes are going to get bigger. And if you look at the shield up there on the left, you can see that one of the hole on the left is different in shape than the hole on the right. And it's just getting bigger. So we see the same kind of resorption. Now, people will say often, well, if that were true, you'd get some intermediates. You'd get some that had just the beginning of a hole. And there is one. There's a thing called Netoceratops that has a small hole in it. But you know what people are saying now? They say, well, it's got a small hole. It must be a different kind of dinosaur. And that's basically what they say. But as we all know, if you're going to go from a shield that has no hole in it to a shield that has a big hole in it, somewhere you've got to have a shield with a little hole in it. There's also some indication that people have suggested that there's these little triangular bones along the edge of the frill. And people say, well, Torosaurus has more of them than Triceratops does. But in all of our specimens, they have varying numbers. We do know they start out as little triangles, they get to be big triangles, and then they change shape. They flatten out and become a different shape. So some of our specimens have one number and some have another number. We have different numbers on one side of the frill and we have on the other side of the frill. And we just can't find a whole lot of consistency in these things. So we certainly don't think that that is something that we can use to determine one genus from another. So, in my view, Torosaurus does not exist.
So that's the thing. I mean, it's evidence, and that evidence is falsified. Test hypothesis. And so, I mean, it's a big case of pretty fast evidence, and we're starting to see the
Okay, I'm going to talk about Torosaurus and Triceratops, one dinosaur or two. I'll look at the fossils, and I'd just like to say that thanks for you guys for coming here, and just like to say I think Jack has some really interesting ideas about Torosaurus and Triceratops, and it's been very provocative, and it's kind of got us to take another look at these fossils and try and look at them in a different way. And I think there's some very interesting ideas. But we've got some new evidence that we think will shed some light on this, and we'll try and, we've got some surprises for you here tonight. So just to summarize things, paleontology and biology start out with species. Ultimately, it all goes back to species. Before you can talk about diversity, evolution, extinction, you have to know how many species there are, you have to name your species. So the issue that Jack has brought up is, how do you know if the species we name are actually real, or just young and old of one animal? How do we know if we're doing it right? And we are proposing a 3-part test to see if you're actually looking at just the old and the young of the same species. We need to look at 3 things: the range, where are the animals found? 2, we need to look for the existence of intermediates. And 3, we need to look at age. Not age in the sense of how many millions of years old they are, but that is, are they mature or are they immature? And we've done this for Torosaurus and Triceratops, and we found some surprises along the way. And I'll just show you what we're getting here tonight. So the horned dinosaurs were originally described here at Yale by O.C. Marsh, who was the first head of the Peabody Museum. He had teams of guys. He would send them out west and just they'd collect skulls left, right, and center. And they collected these skulls. The original Torosaurus, they collected Triceratops, and these come from the latest Cretaceous, 65 million years ago in the American West. And the ceratopsids are these giant, 4-legged, plant-eating dinosaurs with huge horns and these head shields, and nothing like this had ever been seen before. These were pretty big scientific news when they came out. And perhaps more importantly, Marsh's fossils, well, we'd seen dinosaurs from Europe before, just little bits and pieces. And for the first time, Marsh and the guys who followed them put together an entire ecosystem and showed what the dinosaurs were like. And in particular, these dinosaurs here lived in the final 1,000,000 years of the age of dinosaurs. This is the twilight of the dinosaurs, right before the Cretaceous ends, an asteroid comes down, and the dinosaurs vanish forever. And that's why these dinosaurs are particularly important. Now, they collected a lot of skulls, and they named a lot of species. Pretty much every time they got a halfway decent skull, they noticed it was different from the ones they had before. And they said, well, it's different, okay, new species. Marsh did a lot of this, some other guys did it. And by my count, and I might not have this right, they named Triceratops 14 times. So Jack is right, they've overdone it. And Ostrom was the guy who kind of came along and said, you know, you guys have gone a little bit too far, we need to pull back on this. So we had Horridus, Porus, Galeus, Flatlatus, Serratus, Elatus, etc., etc. And Horner said, you know, we think we have a lot fewer than that, and now we're down to about 2. And as Jack has argued, it looks like this guy with the short nose, Horridus, is earlier, and this guy with the long nose, Porus, is later, and pretty much everything fits into those 2. But until Jack came along, pretty much everybody identified these 2 guys as separate. So what makes them separate? Why is Triceratops different from Torosaurus? Well, it's not rocket science, it's paleontology. And what we have here is the differences. We have Triceratops, there's this short, thick frill here. Torosaurus has this long, thin frill here. In Triceratops, the frill is a solid shield. And in Torosaurus, has these huge holes in there. And Triceratops always has 5 to 7 little hornlets on the back of the frill, and it has 1 in the middle. And Torosaurus always has 10 or 12 little hornlets on the back of the frill. And that's how you tell them apart. There are a few other differences. Triceratops sometimes has a long nose horn, Torosaurus never does, but that's the basics of it. So what's the problem? Well, as Jack has pointed out correctly, you've got this issue with development. And this is a related dinosaur called Protoceratops, a little frilled dinosaur from Mongolia. And you'll see it changes a lot as it gets older. And if you didn't have all these guys in between, you might think this and this were totally separate species, but they're just one animal. And this has definitely created problems in the past. And here's an example of where it's been a problem and how we fixed it. This is an animal called Nanotyrannus, the mini tyrannosaur. And you can see it's got a longer, narrower snout, more slender jaws, lots of tiny teeth, great big eye. Different species, at least some people said so. Other people said this is just a young T-Rex. So how do you tell the difference? The first is you look at where they come from. If they never occur together, it's kind of hard for them to be the same species. But in fact, Nanotyrannus comes from out here in Wyoming, where Triceratops and Torosaurus do, and it occurs alongside T-Rex. So that's consistent with them being one species. The second is intermediates. Nanotyrannus here, T-Rex up here. If you line them all up from small to big, they just transform one into the other perfectly. Nice, perfect growth series. That's consistent with this being just the juvenile of this. And last of all, to be a juvenile T-Rex, it has to be, well, a juvenile, fairly obviously. And you can get at that by looking at bone texture. And you have this kind of coarse grain to the bone. And this is typical, we know from looking at modern animals, typical of young, rapidly growing animals. And this is a juvenile feature. So we're 3 for 3. These guys live in the same time and place. They're intermediates that link these into a series, and it's immature. And most people would buy now that this is young T-Rex. It's not impossible it's something separate, but we don't have any good evidence to make it anything else. So this definitely happens, and it is a major problem. But that means we can also solve it, just like we did for T-Rex. We can look at these three things. Look at the range. If they're the same dinosaur, Torosaurus and Triceratops have to occur together. We can look for intermediates. If these are the same dinosaur, there have to be things that are perfectly in between the two. And then age. If this is really the adult of Triceratops, these animals all have to be adult, and these guys have to be more immature. And if the fossils show 1, 2, and 3, then I'm willing to concede that these are the same species. We have to admit that's probably the most likely explanation. But if even one of these fails, then they've got to be separate species. You've got to have all these where you don't have a case to make these the same species. So what do we see? Well, we went and we looked at the data from the literature, from the museums, and tried to figure this out. And we looked at the distribution, first of all. And they co-occur in a lot of places, but the distributions don't match perfectly. Notably, you don't get any Torosaurus up here. And Triceratops is, when you go out and look, there's tons and tons of Triceratops here and the occasional Torosaurus. But it's only Torosaurus down here as far as we know. So the distributions don't match up perfectly. But it's also possible we haven't looked hard enough. Maybe there are a few Torosaurus up there if we look more. Maybe there's Triceratops if we look down there. So the distributions don't match, but I'm willing to concede this point to Jack, that maybe it's close enough that we can't rule out the possibility this is one species of dinosaur based on where we find them in the fossil record. So what about intermediates? You can see how remarkably different these animals look. But as we saw before with T-Rex, with Protoceratops, you can have different looking endpoints and then things that connect them. Do these actually exist? So one issue is the hornlets. Now it's true that these hornlets vary a little bit, but the key thing is you don't find anything in between the two. That's the key part here. You get plus or minus one hornlet. Occasionally they'll be missing one or something. But Triceratops always has 5 to 7. With maybe 1 or 2 exceptions, it's got one in the middle. Torosaurus always has 10 to 12. It's never got one in the middle. And the key thing is there's never anything in between those two. So there's variation in each one, but they never overlap. And if they were the same species, you'd have to find things in between as they're adding hornlets. And we've never found those fossils. The other issue is the frill. Now, Jack is arguing that you go from this big open frill here to this solid frill here by basically opening up these holes. And that seems possible. It seems like maybe you could just eat away a bunch of bone. There's these kind of thin regions here that Jack has identified as the start of these holes. What we found is, when we looked at a bunch of these skulls and looked at the underside, is if you look at where this thin region is, it doesn't match the two. So this bone is called the parietal in Torosaurus. And you notice the holes go straight through the middle of the parietal. The thin regions here in Triceratops are right on the edge of the parietal, and then this depression actually goes over onto the second bone called the squamosal. So if this is turning into the holes, why are they in a completely different place? I mean, if this was going to open up into a hole, you'd have a hole right here, not in the middle of this bone here. So that really doesn't seem to match. And again, we don't have anything that's perfectly in between the two. That's kind of the issue here, is there's nothing in between the two. And Jack has identified this thing called Netoceratops as being a potential fossil in between this and this. The problem, and it's true that Netoceratops has a small hole in the frill. That's not the issue. The issue with Netoceratops isn't that it has a hole. It's got too many holes. That's the problem. It's got holes all over the frill. It's got a hole here, it's got a hole there, it's got a hole there. They're all different sizes, they're kind of wonky shapes. The dinosaur looks like Swiss cheese. And the issue there is that it's pretty clearly not a healthy, normal individual. The holes are all irregular, they're not even the same on the left and right sides. It's a sick animal. It's either been injured or it's got some weird disease, but it's really not a good example of something in between there. So we've been collecting dinosaurs for more than 100 years there. Jack, as he's told you, he's collected more than 100 skulls, but we don't have a single really convincing example of something in between there. And it's true the fossil record is bad, but after 100 years of collecting, after hundreds of skulls, why don't we have one really good thing in here to link these two? And the fact that we don't have it, I think at this point is pretty good evidence that it doesn't exist. So I'd argue that test 2 has failed. We really don't have the intermediate fossils to link these two. And here's a picture of Nidoceratops I was telling you about. Notice how the holes on the left and right sides are different sizes. They're all irregular in shape, and the hole here has a kind of really wonky shape. This is just a sick Triceratops, is the most likely explanation, at least in my opinion. So the third thing is age. Are Torosaurus consistently older than Triceratops? And Jack has some really interesting approaches using histology. We took a different approach. We looked at these skull sutures, we looked at bone surface, basically surface histology, and we also looked at some things like horn length. Now the key thing about our method is we don't actually destroy any dinosaurs. And the key thing there is that means that curators aren't afraid of us when we come and say we want to study your dinosaurs. Like, go ahead, just you're going to take pictures as long as you're not going to chop them up. And so that means we can look at lots and lots of dinosaurs. So we were able to look at 36 specimens. We looked at 6 Torosaurus and 30 Triceratops. And in particular, we were able to look at, using our approach, 2 critical skulls. This is the second Peabody skull, the second Torosaurus Marsh collected, and this is a small skull at Philadelphia. And we were able to look at these skulls using our approach. Now, humans start out with our skull bones separate and they knit together as we get older. This doesn't happen in all dinosaurs, but fortunately it happens in horned dinosaurs, and we can use this. You can see here, in some animals, the skull is all open, there's all these separate bones, and it just completely fuses together. And this happens in a distinct sequence. First, the skull roof fuses. The next thing that happens is there's some little hornlets. The hornlets on the edge of the frill fuse. There's the hornlet on the cheek that fuses. And the third thing that happens is the nose fuses up. So you have these separate bones here, and then here it's all one big mass as these bones have completely fused together. And this happens in a sequence so we can figure out where animals fit in that sequence. Now, the original Torosaurus that Marsh described as Torosauruslatus is old. There's no sutures whatsoever. This is an old individual. So that seems consistent with Torosaurus being an old Triceratops, right? Well, no one would deny that they're old Torosaurus. There have to be, if it's a separate species, or if it's an old Triceratops, if it's a separate species, there have to be old individuals. So this isn't surprising. The question is, are there any juveniles? And we think we can answer that for the first time. This is the Philadelphia Torosaurus. And all we did is just go down and photograph it and kind of look at what's going on with the skull. And we found the skull roof here is pretty well fused up. So it's getting to be mature. But these bones are separate. The snout is still separate from the nose, and the beak here has fallen off. This animal is not quite full grown. It gets more interesting though. This is the second Torosaurus skull that Marsh described. And of course, Marsh being Marsh, there's different species of Torosaurus, Torosauruslatus. But now we just think it's Torosauruslatus. But you can see it's a really big animal. It's about 9 feet long. It's a monster. But we weren't really able to figure out what was going on because it had been all covered up with plaster and paint. And so we got permission from Jacques to chip the paint and plaster off and see what was going on underneath there and see what all these bones were doing, that nobody would be able to tell what they were doing because it was all in this reconstruction. And the results were pretty shocking. Basically, even though it's a huge animal, it shows numerous features of immaturity. So there's a hornlet there that fuses on in adults, that's fallen off. These are the contacts for the skull bones, where it's just sitting loosely on there. The beak here, there's a chunk of the beak, that's fallen off. This is a little knob on the back of the skull where the spinal column attaches. And it's 3 separate bones instead of being fused into one bone, which is what happens in the adults. And there should be little hornlets fused onto the back there, but they've all fallen off. And this is one of the striking things, though. You can see the grain of the bone. This is young, fast-growing bone. This animal had not finished growing. Even though it's gigantic, it's not quite mature. The other thing we got is we got adult Triceratops. This is the Triceratops prorsus, the original on display there, and you can go out and see the specimen. And the beak here is completely fused onto the snout. The snout is completely fused on the rest of the skull. The skull roof is fused up. The hornlets are all on the edge there. The little cheek hornlet is fused on there. So we have what seem to be very, very mature Triceratops, more mature than our Torosaurus. And we used a computer to kind of order all these things using these characters and say who's more old than who, and this is what we came up with. It's some younger Torosaurus, some not quite mature Torosaurus, some of these specimens are fully mature Torosaurus, and then Triceratops kind of ranges up and down here, but we get some very old Triceratops. So that's kind of the issue here, is Horner and Scannella looked at the histology and they saw that Torosaurus was more mature, but they've only looked at a couple of Torosaurus, whereas with this study we've been able to look at multiple specimens and see the full range of variation from young to old in Torosaurus. One really surprising thing we found is the size and maturity aren't quite related. So this animal, this giant thing here, has a lot of features of being immature. This one seems to be much more mature, even though it's smaller. And that really, it blows you away how different these things are in terms of size. This is like half again as big. And our best guess is that this maybe is a male, a teenage male, and this is sort of a young adult female. And Triceratops shows something very similar to this. We're not positive about this, but it's an idea that's kind of come out of this study. So in conclusion, it's unclear if Torosaurus and Triceratops really lived in the same time and in the same place. We don't have any clear, convincing, definitive examples of intermediates between the two, which at this point is surprising. We don't have anything like that if they really are the same species. And Torosaurus includes both younger animals and old animals, not just old animals. Likewise, Triceratops includes both younger animals and older animals, and not just the young ones. So we'd argue that the fossil evidence shows that Torosaurus is not a Triceratops. So why does this all matter? Is this all just about naming stuff? It's just us paleontologists liking to name stuff for the glory of naming it or whatever. And I've named some dinosaurs. This is a skull I found down in New York. And when I saw this, I realized it didn't look like anything I'd ever seen before. And I thought the frill looked really funky, so I thought I needed a funky name, so I decided to call it Mojoceratops. And so I've named some of these things, but what is it ultimately about besides just getting your name on a dinosaur? And the key thing, the reason why this is so important, why we've got to get it right, and why I think it's really important to recognize all the species that are out there, is we can't say anything about evolution or diversity or extinction if we don't. So this is a recent study we did on, these are bird shoulder bones from the latest Cretaceous, 65 million years ago. This is the same time as T-Rex and Torosaurus and Triceratops, right before they all go extinct. There were 8 known species of birds. After looking at it, we found there were 10 species that hadn't been recognized before. And we were able to show that of those 18, only one of them is actually known to survive the impact of the asteroid. So because we got the diversity right, we were able to make some statements about the extinction and say that there's a mass extinction of birds at the same time the dinosaurs go out. And some exciting stuff we've been doing here at the Peabody is we've been moving on to lizards. So now we're battling about how many lizard species there are, but we think we have 8 new lizard species for a total of 28 lizards living alongside T-Rex and Torosaurus and Triceratops. And of those, 80% go extinct when the asteroid hits. And this is the kind of cool stuff you can do by getting into the nitty-gritty of how many species there are and why these debates really matter. And if you know how many species there are, you can figure out what happens to them and how many go extinct. And on a more personal level, why do we name so many? I mean, Marsh loved to name dinosaurs. And he named Triceratops, Brontosaurus, Stegosaurus, 80 dinosaurs. 67 of those are no longer considered real dinosaurs. And some people say it was just this rivalry he had with his rival Cope. And he was just trying to beat Cope, and it was all about these guys fighting each other and butting heads. And maybe that was what motivated Marsh. But I think there's something more to it about naming dinosaurs and why we like to name dinosaurs. And for me, it goes back to this. This is how I got into science. I grew up in Alaska on a little island called Kodiak Island and lived right on the water. And when I was 5 years old, I would go down and look at all the amazing species in the tide pools. Flip over rocks and find octopuses and starfish and these amazing little crabs. When my dad was out in the Bering Sea fishing king crab, I would be down there looking at these little crabs in the tide pools. And I thought there was nothing cooler than seeing a species of crab that I hadn't ever seen before. And the only thing I could imagine that would be cooler than that would be finding a species of crab that nobody had ever seen before. And I learned all the Latin for this. And I never did find a new species of crab. But over the years, I started going through museum collections instead of flipping over rocks in the tide pools. And I started finding new things and naming them. And so I've named these dinosaurs like Hesperonychus and Mojoceratops, now Albertonicus. And it's really an amazing experience to understand the life of the past and bring these things back to life in a way and see things that we've never really seen before. And that's what I think is really amazing about naming new dinosaurs. So I'd just like to thank everybody who's helped make this project possible, including my collaborator, Daniel Field, and the curators here, and the people who've helped with the preparation of specimens, and people who've helped funded us, and the collections who have let us pour over their dinosaur bones. And I guess I'd like to just thank you guys for coming tonight.
Well, I didn't bring all my dinosaurs with me to show you. But the parietal opening on Triceratops, the parietal of Triceratops is very thin in just the right places. Not in the squamosal. It is thin where it ought to be, and it's real easy to measure it. So, just take one of those things that measures the thickness of things. Put it right over it, measure it. Big Triceratops specimens have a very thin parietal right where it should be. It's going to be a hole. And when it comes to bone fusion, you know, especially fusing up the front of the face, again, like I said before, a lot of it has to do with taphonomy. You get a specimen that has laid out on the ground for a long time, you can get a big specimen that is completely disarticulated and have one just like it that looks like it's fused together because you found it in sandstone. There's a big difference. And do you have that in there? Vanessa, would you give me the epinasal? Here's a epinasal that we brought along just to show and tell. This is the nasal horn of a Triceratops, and it is disarticulated. I mean, it is not fused together. You can have that. You can have it for your visit. I mean, this is a big specimen, and it's not fused together. I'm sure they do fuse together sooner or later, but maybe not. We haven't actually found a parietal and a squamosal ever fused together. I don't think they ever fused. They look like they're together. You can find a dinosaur in sandstone, but I think you're going to find when you start looking at all these Triceratops specimens that those that are found in mudstone actually come apart and are disarticulated. Even the occipital condyle, the whole thing. And the ones you find in sandstone are often articulated. And when it comes to this bone texture, you know, the bone texture is interesting. We see long striated growing bone in Torosaur specimens because they're still growing. And we see it in Triceratops as well. And if you cut the bone and actually look at the bone histology, by the way, when we cut the bone, we break the bone out, we cast it, we stick it back in, we put the plastic piece right back in. You cannot tell that we've done that to a few of your specimens. We've even done it with some pterosaurs. We've even done it with some of your pterosaurs. And you cannot tell. So you still have the morphology left. But the nice thing is you have the bone histology, which lasts forever as well. So you really can check out the bone histology of these animals and see how they're growing. And when you see this long striated tissue to things, you can cut it and actually see what's happening. So sometimes they are still growing, but sometimes the striations just are a little bit, they don't tell you exactly what's going on inside, because not only is something growing in one direction, it's growing in several different directions. But resorption is also going on. And resorption is the important one to make holes in a frill. And holes in a frill your surface texture looks very different.
Okay.
Okay, can I have the projector again? Couple more slides I want to show here. So, the lights too. So we're going to do a brief look at bone, and then we're going to look at the bones. So this is going to be, so Jack has proposed an elliptic bone remodel. Basically, bone kind of starts out spongy here, and over time you get these things, these secondary Haversian systems. So basically, the bone cells come in here, and they eat their way through the bone, and they deposit new bone behind it, and you get these little circular tunnels and trails where the bone's been remodeled. This is secondary bone. You have old bone, and it's replaced by this new bone.
Can you use the mic, Nick?
Yeah, probably a good idea. So can we use this to figure out how old the animal is? This seems like a logical idea. So this is what secondary Haversian bone looks like. And the idea is the more of this you have, the more new bone you have, the older your animal is because there's been more time for this to happen. So the question is, does this actually work in living animals? Now we know skull fusion works in living animals, we know it works in mammals, we know it works in birds, it works in lizards, it works in a lot of different things. You can use this to roughly tell how old something is. But what about living animals? So you can see here there's just kind of this sort of bone here, just layers down. And there's these little circles there. Secondary bone, Haversian remodeling. So which animal is older? There's lots of remodeling here, so show of hands, who thinks A is older and who thinks B is older? You think A is older? Yeah. Okay. B, all these Haversian systems. Okay. Sorry if you feel like I tricked you on that one there. But, just to kind of make the point that if I was a paleontologist and I didn't know that was one bone, I might say, well, this is a young animal, there's no remodeling, and this bone down here is totally remodeled, that's got to be an old animal. So I'm not saying that the approach Jack is using doesn't work, but it needs to be tested, I think, more thoroughly to show that it does work before we can say, based on the degree of remodeling.
Can I say something? When we cut a bone, we cut the whole thing. We don't just cut a little piece out of it.
So that's, I don't know, I think it raises some issues. I mean, unless you cut through the entire bone everywhere.
That's what we do.
You destroy the entire bone?
That's what we do.
So I would basically argue, you've got some very subtle differences between Torosaurus and Triceratops, and some major differences in a single bone. I think this method needs to be shown to work in living animals before we can apply it to dinosaurs. And I think that's something that needs to be done. And the next thing I want to look at, just to kind of get this whole issue of, are these things just falling apart? Well, let's look at the fossils. And my co-author here, Dan, why don't you bring the fossils over and let's get some light on this. Please don't break these or we're dead. Because this is Torosaurus and this is Triceratops. And these are not just any Torosaurus and any Triceratops. This is the beak of the original Triceratops. That's one of the kind of cool things about being somewhere like at Yale. I mean, not only is there prehistory, there's history here. This is the first Triceratops horridus, the original. And Jacques will kill me if I drop this. So, great. So hold that guy up. This is the Triceratops horridus, and you can see here, the beak is, it kind of comes up here, there's a bit of a suture there, but you can't see any gap between the beak bone and the snout at all. This is the bone we have from our Torosaurus, where it's unfused. So here, these are the sutures where it would attach to the beak. So you can see a clear articulation there, and this is totally together. And it seems difficult for me to buy that these things have just fallen off. Another one, we've got the cheek. And this is the cheek of the original Triceratops. Flip it around there and you can see the horn. And this is the cheek hornlet of our Torosaurus. And there's a nice big suture there where it hasn't fused on. And again, it's hard to see that this has just fallen off. And then we've got this guy. This is a chunk of the skull off of the original Triceratops. You can see all this kind of gnarly, nasty, old, grotty-looking bone here. And that guy right there, this has this smooth, striated bone. This is young, rapidly growing bone. This is the Torosaurus. So we have Torosaurus, rapidly growing bone, old bone in Triceratops. We have a Torosaurus where the cheekbone is infused on, the cheek horn. And we have a Torosaurus where the beak bone is fallen off. So we'd argue that these fossils, it's pretty hard for us to see that this is just the fact that it's in mudstone or sandstone. There's really a difference in how these bones are put together. So I think that, I
can say Dan sure is a dip Vanna White.
Well, I will still argue that you need your taphomorphology, you need your stratigraphy, especially, because we're looking at different fusion timing in different species. So, here's what I would think that you should do. You've got a whole bunch of people in here that probably are donors to this museum. I think Yale University should go back. I think you should take all of these Triceratops specimens that have no data and put them in boxes and put them in storage and go out and get some new specimens that have data. And then I think you can answer this question.
Well, donors. Let's get some questions now from the audience here. I mean, first of all, let's thank these guys. Science in action, right? We are not a religion. We can be wrong. And we're both willing to admit that. And the fun part here is when Jack or Nick sets out the argument and expresses clearly the circumstances under which they would accept that they are wrong. We'll get to that in a minute, but let's get some questions here to you, Matt.
Yes, if for the original specimens that you just showed us, what kind of data came along with that? I mean, as far as where they were found and how deep and all the things that Jack talked about. How much data do you have with those?
there's not a heck of a lot. We have some roughly, some of the specimens actually have quarries, and you could probably go out there and figure out precisely how far they go up or down in the section, but it's a pretty limited area with a limited number of rock outcrops out there. There's only about 1 million years worth of time, so we know off the bat that rock only is deposited over this period of time. We know where we are in time within maybe 1.5 million years. And I think that the stratigraphy matters a lot if you want to tell Triceratops from Triceratops, because you have the Triceratops evolving into different Triceratops. But it seems to be a little bit less critical if we're trying to tell Torosaurus from Triceratops. Although it may be, I think what would be really interesting to know is, does Torosaurus show the same thing? I would predict there might be more advanced Torosaurus later in time and more primitive ones earlier in time, just like we see with Triceratops. And that's where it would be really amazing to get some stratigraphic data.
Sure.
I'm interested in knowing, you talked about the histology, I'm interested in the chemistry of the bone. You mentioned a lot of sick animals or immatures. Has anybody done any studies on the relative amounts of calcium and phosphorus in these bones and see if there's a difference?
The phosphorus leaches out pretty quickly, so the chemistry is different in the fossil bone than it is in a modern bone.
Can you tell between them, though, which is got more calcium, let's say, or does
Well, it depends on, the chemistry of the bone depends on really where this kind of sediments that it comes out of. So, it comes out of mudstone, it's different than whether it comes out of sandstone. But, I don't think that Netoceratops is a sick dinosaur.
Question, if the frill is thinning, would not other parts of the anatomy be thinning also, as it does in humans when you have bone thinning over time?
It's not osteoporosis.
Are you sure?
Yes, I'd love to.
Oh, not you, Dan, come on. You're Colin, you're on the paper. That's not fair. There we go.
What if you find pieces of new dinosaurs made look like Torosaurus and Triceratops both?
That's what Netoceratops is.
That is a really good question. That is precisely what we need to find, and if you found that animal, and it was clear it was a well-preserved animal, and it wasn't an injured individual, and it was clearly in between the two, I would have to throw up my hands and say, they're the same thing. But we've been looking for, Marsh started describing these things in the 1880s, so we're more than 100 years later, and we've collected dozens of skulls. Jack alone has got 100 skulls, and we don't have a single really clear example, anything that would, convince the skeptic that, there really is something in between the two. And the fact that we don't have it, I think, is one of the really powerful arguments that Marsh got it right and Torosaurus really is separate.
And I think we do have.
Speak up, please.
I know between Torosaurus and Triceratops that they do look the same, but I know lengthwise they're both different sizes. Triceratops is 30 feet long and Torosaurus is 25 feet long, and by the length of Torosaurus' skull, it's like 10 feet, and I think I don't think Torosaurus would be a juvenile Triceratops because all Triceratops skulls are probably same like width throughout each age. It doesn't make sense that they're like animal.
Let's ask the expert about that.
But can you summarize the question?
Yeah, question? I think the question was that they're different in lengths. And one of the interesting things is that they both vary a lot in length. Torosaurus skulls go from about 6 feet to about 9 feet. And Triceratops probably go from about maybe 4.5, 5 feet to 8 feet in length. So they both show a huge range of sizes. And I think if Torosaurus were all adult, they'd all be big, but they're not. And the fact that we don't see that, I think, is kind of maybe evidence that they're not the same thing.
What you've been saying is that the different textures and the different types of stone that bones have been found in affect the way that they are preserved. So, wouldn't that, take away from the age, and, like you were saying, the different textures of the age, and wouldn't, if it was a different kind of rock, take away from the bone even more, and wouldn't get to tell the difference?
I think, we have to go back and look at the data a little bit more closely, but my impression is that Marsh collected almost exclusively out of sandstones, because the stuff in mudstone is really poorly preserved, so we didn't want it. He only hit sandstone for the most part, and we've got the stuff we have here in the Yale collections is both fused and unfused, and so I'm not convinced that there really is a difference there.
You talk about juvenile and adult. How old do these things live to be? I don't really know.
Whew, that's a good question. Maybe.
We'll tell you soon.
Yeah. You can't tell from the skulls, you need the leg bones. And unfortunately for a lot of these, all we have is the skulls. But the leg bones have like growth rings like a tree, and if you chop into those, you can figure that out.
We have those too.
You mentioned you had a protocol basically for how you sample a bone, and you sample it all over. So what is your basic protocol, and where are you sampling within the skull as a pro?
Within the skull, we cut the base of the horn, the middle of the horn, and the end of the horn, both in transverse and longitudinal sections. So we get a lot of slides, a lot of sections out of it. Then we take and we cut anterior to posterior through the shield, the parietal, the squamosal. We get big sections, yes.
Yeah.
And we cut transversely through the parietal and the squamosal as well. Well, that's for the squamosal, the parietal, and the postorbital horns. We also cut the nasal horn, and we cut the nasals, and we cut through the beak, looking just for what he was talking about, whether it is fused or not. Because we find a lot of times they're look like they're fused together, and they're not. When you get into looking inside of it. So we cut a lot of bones. And then we cut their leg bones as well, if they have leg bones.
Cody?
I was wondering, are there any species of dinosaur for which there are enough known immature individuals that you could compare across different stratigraphies to see if the fusion does differ a lot for like immature individuals?
We're actually doing that, yes. It's interesting that the Yale people collected an awful lot of dinosaurs for a long time and they didn't get any juveniles. I mean, juveniles. And we have lots and lots and lots of them. So we have little ones, the big ones, and we're cutting those too. We cut everything.
And it actually turns out we have, like, if you look at like the Protoceratops, for example, it doesn't sort of show the same type of fusion. So the technique we used on Torosaurus and Triceratops seems to work for this subgroup of dinosaurs, but we can't apply it elsewhere because they're really weird in fusing up the skull. So the method doesn't work. And I'd just like to comment on, as far as the histology, like Jack is maybe cutting up a couple of skulls and getting a lot of cuts out of them, but without cutting, if you're only cutting old individuals, which is I think what is happening, and you're not cutting the Philadelphia skull, and you're not cutting the big Torosaurus, the one that we have over here, and those are the young animals. If you're not cutting them, it doesn't matter how many times you cut an old animal, you're going to tell that it's an old animal. If you're not cutting the young animals, you can't tell if there's young Torosaurus.
We are cutting a Torosaur specimen that Andy Farkey says is still growing, that has striated bone.
Good.
Are there any other dinosaurs in the fossil record that are closely related to the Triceratops/Torosaur? And if so, are there any intermediate forms between them? And if not, is the absence of any intermediate form between that other dinosaur and the Triceratops or Torosaurus more or less concerning to you than the absence of intermediates between juvenile and adult?
In terms of evolution between Torosaurus and Triceratops?
Yeah, the difference between the next opposed to go to the back in the fossil record.
Yes. Yeah, that's a really good question. And I would argue that if you look at the latest Triceratops, and this is a big difference between Triceratops and Torosaurus, is the nose horn. This is the full-size nose horn of the Torosaurus one of the Torosaurus here at the Peabody. Short nose horn. Monster nose horn in Triceratops. This is another reason why Triceratops' three-horned face and Torosaurus probably aren't the same. Look at the difference in these nose horns. But this is the youngest Triceratops. That's Prorsus. As you go back in time, you get a short nose in Triceratops. That's Triceratops horridus. And if you get, then there's some specimens that look even less like Triceratops horridus, and they kind of look a little more Torosaurus-like because they got a bit longer frill. They're still a Triceratops, but they've got, there's one in the museum in New York, it's a Triceratops, has all the diagnostic features, but the skull, the frill is really long, and it might be an even more primitive Triceratops. So I think we are seeing that. And my prediction would be that if you could go back in time, you'll see animals that kind of mix the features of these guys. There's one called Eotriceratops from Canada that's older than either of these guys. And it might be that intermediate. It might be the ancestor of Torosaurus and Triceratops, but we need a better skull from that animal to really know.
That's a Triceratops horridus in his hand there. And this is a Triceratops prorsus here.
Okay, Jack, why if there are two species of Triceratops, Prorsus and horridus, Triceratops prorsus, long nose horn, if that turns into a Torosaurus, why are there no Torosaurus with a nose horn like this?
There actually are.
I've never seen one. Not where? What specimen number?
Well, you're just going to have to wait for ours to come.
Show me the evidence.
We will.
We've never seen it in 100 years.
Well, your collection comes from 100 years ago, and mine comes from now. So it just takes us a while to prepare them. How long do you want to send some prepared?
Well, that's not how science works. You can't say, I've got something, and but nobody can see it. You've got to publish it. You can't bring other stuff.
So let's step back.
One thing is clear. Let me just tell you, this is absolute. One of us is right, and one of us is wrong.
But on that note, hold on a minute now, I want to know, let's play science here. Nick, what evidence would you accept to prove that you're wrong?
I would want to
State it clearly for the audience here. What is it that Jack will produce where you go, game over?
something that lives at the exact same time as Torosaurus and Triceratops, but is perfectly intermediate between the two, in terms of it's got perfectly intermediate, and we've got enough specimens, we ought to be able to find that thing if it really exists. It would have the start of some nice circular holes in the frill on both sides, be a well-preserved frill, not a sick individual, and the number of scallops on the back of the frill would be between the number in Triceratops and the number in Torosaurus. And there are some other features you'd have to find. There's some grooves on the side, the squamosals in Torosaurus that we don't see in Triceratops, we have to have the start of those. So basically, that intermediate form that we have with Triceratops, that we have with T-Rex and Nanotyrannus, and if we have some of those, and if they exist, there should be a lot of them, then I would concede that Jack has to be right.
And likewise, Jack. What's it going to take?
I just want a juvenile Torosaurus that's actually a juvenile.
And how would you recognize it then to be a juvenile?
Like little, like this long. A skull this long, like we have Triceratops skulls.
We have like one of those. They're so vanishingly rare. And Torosaurus is a rare animal. It's no surprise we haven't found hatchling Torosaurus yet. They must exist.
All right, now we've set it up with data that they would both accept. And so we'll look forward to the future of this find. Let's thank these guys.